And now we see them rise again as the Israelites make their escape out of Egypt. Following the introduction of Moses and his charge to go to Pharaoh and ask Pharaoh to set his people free, there sets up this major power conflict, a real fight between God and Pharaoh about who will win, who will actually get control over these people, the Israelites. Remember that in the Egyptian way of seeing the world, Pharaoh had divine status. He had a lot of power over the economy and what was happening with Israelite people, the forces of labor. He also had magicians who could do amazing things. And so in Exodus chapters 7 to 12, we see this clash of powers take place in the story of the plagues, one after another, of something wild happening with the creation. Those chapters describe a war of attrition, God incrementally revealing with each plague how much more power he has than Pharaoh. We're not going to go through the plagues in detail, but I want us to notice what they tell us about a theology of creation, about who our God is, that is the same God who created the world and now exhibits his power over all of creation. There's no one-to-one equivalence between the plagues and the order in which things happen in Genesis chapter 1, but there are these echoes that show us that what's happening is God is revealing his power over the world that he created at the beginning of Scripture. For instance, we see God exercise power over the rivers, and all the water in Egypt turns from water to blood. This is the same God who put the water there before life began on the world, so of course he can control the water. But after he turns the water to blood and Pharaoh cries out and he begs God to change it back, God can return it to life-giving, restoring water. Later, we see the same God who created all the creatures that walk and fly and swim, produce them in overabundance. So there are these plagues of frogs, gnats, flies, and locusts, or too much disease on animals or humans. What we sometimes forget as we think about these plague stories is that all of these horrible things happen, but that it is God who restores creation back in the direction of life and shalom, away from chaos and death. In the midst of these stories, God saves thousands of lives, God heals diseases, and God brings creation back to the way it should be. What we see in these chapters of Exodus is this epic conflict between Yahweh and Pharaoh that sets up God's liberation of the enslaved people and tells us that God saving his people is about much more than that. It is about God's love and salvation for all of creation, restoring creation to what it should be. And after all these plagues and the back and forth in this conflict of powers, we come upon the final scene, this huge battle described in chapters 13 and 14. But did you notice in what we read that the battle is not between all the Israelites and all the Egyptians? It's still between God and Pharaoh. Because we read this in chapter 13, verse 18, that after the Passover, after the end of the plagues, then Pharaoh finally lets the people go, and we read that the Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt, prepared for battle. Even though the whole conflict had been taking place in a way above them and beyond them at the divine level, the Israelites still feel the need to grab their shields and their swords when they leave their homes and make their way into the wilderness, prepared and ready to fight. There's been no military fighting yet in the story, but they still are hedging their bets, paying their insurance, making sure that they're ready if something needs to happen. We see a bit of ourselves in this story, knowing that God is taking care of us, knowing that God has kept his promises in the past, trusting God with our future, but still hedging our bets, making sure we're doing what is necessary so that we stay safe in our own journeys. Where the Israelites could have exercised faith that God will fulfill his promises to set them free of Egypt, they experience a little fear and they bring their weapons along with them as they get going. But it's not long until they're reminded that God is really in charge of this journey they are making from slavery to freedom. It will not be up to weapons and the courage and the strength of any Israelite army to guarantee their freedom from Egypt. Because on their very first steps away from slavery and away from their oppressors, God shows up in a visible and tangible way, a cloud to lead them on their way by day and a fire by night. visible reminders of God's presence and protection with his people for 40 years ahead in the wilderness. But the Israelites had a good reason to fear. Because we read in chapter 14 that the Pharaoh who let the people go changes his mind one more time. As soon as he learns that the Israelites actually left their homes and left Egypt, he calls up his own chariot to be made ready and calls together his army and begins pursuit. Now think about this. The Israelites have left with all that they own. They're moving very slowly. There's men with their swords and shields, but there's also women with children and older adults crawling along as they walk in a very large column of people. And here comes Pharaoh with his armies as fast as can be, with chariots and horses heading after them. This is not setting up to be a fair fight. So the Israelites look over their shoulders and they see Pharaoh's armies advancing towards them. And they complain for what will be the first of many times in the wilderness ahead. They say to Moses, "Did you bring us out here just so that we could die in the wilderness? Aren't there enough graves in Egypt that we could have died and been buried there?" You see, it is just hours or days into the journey to freedom that the Israelites experienced this real fear, their first taste of it. This long enslaved people immediately want to turn around and go back to what they know. Even though God is promising them freedom in the promised land, a wide open space, they say, let's go back to what we know. It was surely better than the unknown future that God has for us. So the Israelites cry out and listen to how Moses responds to them in chapter 14, verses 13 and 14. He says to God's people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to keep still." Now, at this point, the Israelites have seen God's power displayed over and over again through the series of plagues. They have no doubt of what God is capable of, and yet their hearts are filled with the possibility of fear. They are faced with a decision where their faith is on the line. Is God's power really greater than these armies coming after us? With their back up against the Red Sea, they are caught in a trap. How will we escape this impossible situation? And Moses tells them to not run headlong into battle, but to be still and watch and see the deliverance of the Lord. This is God's battle to fight. And in the end, the Israelites don't escape by raising their swords and shields. They do almost nothing to guarantee their own liberation, about 0% of the effort. Salvation and deliverance will belong to God alone. All the power needed to defeat the evil, the powers of death, the oppressors that Pharaoh represents, and to set the slaves free is all with God. Now, when we think about our own lives here and now, we may not be with our backs up against a huge body of water with armies advancing towards us, but when we reflect on our own lives, we can see these struggles and we wonder, where does the power lie, whether it's in our personal lives or in the world around us. When we think about our own lives, we wonder, does the power lie with the disease I've been diagnosed with, or does it lie with the power for healing? Does the power lie with a broken relationship or with God's promises of restoration? Where does the power lie? It's the same when we expand our vision out to look at our world or the politics and even our own country, these debates over where does the power actually exist? Who's really in charge? Which side is God on? We are challenged by the story of Exodus throughout to see the world through the lens of God's power. And a challenge for us to try to summon faith in the face of fear when we are confronted with opposition or challenge. And to see that the God who has come through for us in the past, who has saved us out of what feels like a trap or a bind or a narrow place, that God will show up for us again in the future to lead us forward to the freedom that God has promised. See, in the story of Exodus, the counterpoint to fear is not internal courage that I can do it. In the story of Exodus, the counterpoint to fear is faith that God can do it. The faith which we are called to today is to trust that God's power is greater than any other power any other force or opposition we see in our own lives or in the world. Imagine this story with me. The Israelites could see the armies of Pharaoh advancing towards them with their chariots and horses and their spears, one of the most powerful armies in the ancient world. And the Israelites could turn over their shoulder and see the Red Sea behind them. They knew exactly how trapped they were and how much reason they had to be afraid. The Israelites could not see the promises God had made. They could not see their way out of this apparent trap. So with an army on one side and their backs up against a huge body of water, the Israelites choose to have faith. The author of Hebrews in chapter 11, verse 1 writes that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. You see, if we can see it, we're not exercising faith. But if it's unknown, if it takes believing in what's not yet there, then we need to have faith. Jim Wallace says that faith is believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change. The Israelites had all the evidence they needed that they were going to be slaughtered in this battle right in front of them. But the evidence changed right in front of their eyes. And while the people of God and the Israelites are not always model examples of faith, in this instance they get it right. They set aside their fear and they stand and watch God achieve their deliverance. They watch God act on their behalf. They trust in God's power to win this last battle against the armies of Egypt. So what happens next? The Creator God continues to act in and through creation, as this God has done throughout the story. God separates the waters of the Red Sea and creates a dry space. This is the same thing God does in Genesis chapter 1 when it says the waters were pushed back and a dry land appeared. It happens here right in front of the Israelites. And a wind holds the water back. In Hebrew and in Greek, wind is the same word for spirit. God, the Spirit, is making a way possible where there was no way for God's people to go through from slavery to freedom. This is the kind of salvation that only God's power could make possible. Where there was no way, now God has made a way. Now the instructions Moses gave to the Israelites a moment ago was, stand still and wait for God to set you free to achieve the victory of this battle. But then they get their marching orders. Then they're told, okay, the Red Sea has been parted, there's dry land, but there's huge walls of water on either side. And they're told to walk through it. You see, sometimes faith looks like standing still and waiting for God to show up. And sometimes faith looks like walking through a scary channel, a big canyon of water on either side, trusting that God will protect us as we walk forward and do something we've never done before. I don't know about you, but if there was a huge body of water there minutes ago, and now all of a sudden there's huge walls of water, I would be pretty afraid to walk forward through the Red Sea. So the Israelites have to trust in God's promises that the water will be held back and they will be safe and they will be brought from slavery to freedom. God's people have faith to get to the other side of this crisis. Just enough faith for what's in front of them, onto dry land. And as soon as they are on the other side of the water, God allows the water to come back over. And in the scriptures, big bodies of water can reflect both safety and chaos. And in this moment, the chaos of the water sweeps over the Egyptian armies. And this battle that had been unfolding between God and Pharaoh for months or possibly years is now over. And God has won a victory over the oppressors, the structures of violence and power that had put the Israelites into slavery. God wins. The sea washes over Pharaoh's army. Pharaoh's army is defeated, but the people of God never have to raise a sword. God wins the battle. At the very end of Exodus chapter 14, we read this summary of all that had happened in this exciting, most exciting day in the history of Israel. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. This sums up the story so clearly. It wasn't Israel that set themselves free from slavery. They didn't raise a sword. They didn't accomplish their own salvation. God did it 100%. And this is where this story lands in our own lives. Because whatever is going on for us, whatever challenge we have on this personal level, or as we look out at our world, we're always caught up in what we can do. How can I get myself through this challenge, this illness, this season of grief? But the reality is we don't have to be enough to fight those battles on our own. God asks us to choose faith over fear, to stand still and watch as God achieves our salvation, but then at the right moment to walk through a challenging, perhaps scary canyon of water and trust that God will bring us safely to the other side. In this clash of powers that unfolds in Exodus between God and Pharaoh, God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who made covenant promises, that God is victorious over evil and over oppression and over those who put God's people into slavery. Now, what happens when the Israelites make it to the other side, when they're finally set free? They burst into a spontaneous celebration of worship in chapter 15. And that's what we'll be looking at next week as we focus on this idea that when we worship, we are celebrating God's salvation on our behalf. All of worship is an expression of gratitude for what God has done for us. It is lifting our hearts and minds and voices and bodies to praise God because God does what God says God will do. God shows up. But before we get there next week, what does the story of this clash of powers, these plagues, and this setting free of Israel by going through the Red Sea, what does this have to say to us today? Well, as we look at this ancient story, we are challenged to look at our own lives and look at our own world and see, where does real power lie? Discern where God is in the stories of the world around us. The God who heard his people groaning in slavery. The God who understood the pain and suffering of his people and chose to set them free. The God who said, don't worry about your military power. I'll handle this one for you. Where does real power lie in our world? And this story, as we look at the Israelites, where they get it right every now and then, this story challenges us to choose faith over fear, to trust in God's power to achieve the victories we need in our lives. It gives us the freedom to stop striving for a moment and trying to do it all ourselves, and to stand still and watch God at work. This great ancient story reminds us that our God has already won the battle. It's already been achieved for us. It's already been won here in Exodus, but it's already been won. The battle has been won for us in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That death has been defeated. Evil is the victim. God has won. And we stand back and watch what God has done for us. Our God has saved God's people. Our God does save us, and our God will save us. And we are invited to stand back and watch our God at work. And then when we are called to walk forward in faith, that God will lead us safely into the freedom to which he has called us. Thanks be to God. Amen. Let's pray together. God, we give you thanks for these amazing stories that show your power at work in the world. These stories that show us where your heart is, that your heart is with people who are suffering, people experiencing oppression, and your heart is to lead them to freedom. So God, may we hear this story, and will your Spirit lead us to live in response to this, to live choosing faith over fear, to live trusting that we don't need to pick up the sword and fight our own battles, but to trust that you are fighting for us. God, will your Spirit develop, lead us step by step into greater faith in you, a relational trust and confidence in who you say you are. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Let us stand and respond to God's great work in our life with our final song.